So my name's Paul Horne. I'm an entomologist from Melbourne in Australia, and I run a very small company called IPM Technologies. When we meet people who might have tried IPM, sometimes they say we tried IPM and it didn't work. And often that is because they tried elements of IPM, but the I in IPM stands for integrated. And so it's really important that the strength of an IPM strategy is using all the components together, not just some of them. So for example, people might say we tried putting flowering plants around the border and that didn't do anything, but possibly that's because the spray program needed to be modified. And so if you're encouraging beneficials but still killing them, it's not going to work. We've been operating as IPM Technologies for 29 years, and sometimes growers come to us and we can help them change before there's a crisis. But unfortunately, the most common reason that people come to us and ask for help is where the pesticides have been failing. And so there's a crisis and they cannot produce their crop to an acceptable standard using the methods that they're familiar with, which is usually a pesticide-based strategy. So the drivers often are resistance with developing within the pest, diamondback moth, two-spotted mite, western flower thrip. These are some of the most common ones. When they've got a spray program and the pest can tolerate the sprays, obviously there's a need to do something different. Integrated pest management means many things to many people. I think there's 100 odd definitions in the scientific literature, but for me, it's a very simple thing. It's the combination of biological, cultural, and pesticide controls all working in a compatible way. The pests in potato crops in Australia and New Zealand are mostly very, very similar or the same. So the key pests for many years have been potato moth, maybe a couple of other caterpillars, aphids. Thrips in Australia are also important as vectors of virus. And so an IPM strategy involves the biocontrol agents that eat those. And so there's a range of generalist predators and some specific parasitic wasps. They control or help control those key pests in Australia and New Zealand. The cultural controls are in a lot of cases even more important than the biological controls. So for tuber moth, soil management and irrigation are the key. If growers don't use the right cultural controls, the biocontrol part is not going to deliver everything that they want. And then there's pesticides. And so in Australia, the use of pesticides for controlling those pests has dropped away quite considerably since I started work a long time ago. And that's because the biological and cultural controls deliver an acceptable level of control, an even better level of control than just pesticides alone. So what's happened in the last, I can't remember how many years, tomato potato psyllid arrived in New Zealand, and it carries a disease called Liberibacter, and that is a massive problem, especially for processors. So we have to add tomato potato psyllid into the system. I believe that the set of generalist predators, not the specific parasitoids, but the generalist predators that control aphids and help control caterpillar pests, they're the keys to also controlling potato psyllid. In Australia, Liberibacter hasn't been found, and so that makes life a lot easier. It could be there, but it hasn't been found. What it's meant for Australian potato growers is that they have already got the predators that they need to control potato psyllid because they're there controlling the other pests anyway. The difference between Australia and New Zealand is the relative importance to growers of the potato psyllid and how they react to it. And so there's a greater reliance on pesticides in New Zealand to control that key pest than there is in Australia. We like to make the entire crop a habitat suitable for beneficial species, and that's an important part. But in a potato crop, apart from a very brief period, there's usually no flowers, so there's no nectar source. So parasitic wasps and hoverflies in particular are highly mobile and will live much longer if they get a feed of a sugar source. So having a strip of flowers around the outside will certainly help to encourage populations of those species. Brassica crops in Australia, so things like broccoli, cauliflowers, cabbages, it's a bit different to potatoes, and pesticides are to control diamondback moth in particular. So there's cabbage white butterfly, there's aphids, but the control of those is pretty similar to that in potatoes, where there's a range of predators and parasites that are very, very helpful. But diamondback moth can come in just massive numbers, usually when, in Australia, when the canola dries out, there's a big movement from broadacre to intensive horticulture. And so growers have to deal with a massive influx of a major pest. What's happened in the last few years is that insecticide resistance has become much more widespread, probably starting in the north of Australia, where temperatures are warmer and there's more generations of the moth each year, and the more generations there are, the quicker insecticide resistance develops. But that resistance has now become evident in many more places, including in southern Australia, and so growers are getting worse results with the pesticides that used to give good results. And so we've been encouraging people to use pesticides like BT sprays. Trade names would be things like Dipel or Zentari. There's many other names. They're more difficult to use and previously would have been giving less control than the conventional pesticides. But what's changed is now those BT-based products are almost the strongest tools that we've got, and so growers are relying more and more on that sort of insecticide. If I can add to that, that's not the situation as I understand it in New Zealand at the moment, but potentially what's happening in Australia could be happening in New Zealand in the future. So it would be well worthwhile, I think, looking at what's happening in Australia and trying to avoid the crisis that is happening there at the moment. And so managing pesticide use using an IPM strategy is, to me, the best way to go to prolong the use of pesticides that are compatible in an IPM program. Growers want to trial IPM in, say, potatoes or brassicas. The easiest way to do it is to nominate a paddock where they're going to try a full IPM program, not just parts of it. And so if you can use the biocontrol agents that are all naturally occurring, if you can use as many of the cultural controls as is possible, there's many available, and look at the pesticides that are being used, use them only as required, and use the selective ones that are available. If you can use the full strategy using all the elements of IPM, do it on one paddock, seeing is believing, and so hopefully growers will see on their own farms that this works, it is effective, and then maybe they'll be willing to try 2 or 3 paddocks in the second year and maybe the full farm after that. I can see big differences between Australia and New Zealand in the potato crops and the amount of pesticides used, and I think there's scope to improve that. And with the brassica crops, there isn't a crisis, and so there's the opportunity for New Zealand growers to actually get prepared and avoid some of the bad situations that growers in Australia have got into.